Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters. I am Dr. Ghulam Mir, President of the World Kashmir Awareness Forum. I want to welcome and thank you all for joining us this morning in this very important webinar. The topic for today's webinar is Kashmir Solidarity and Self-Determination in a New Chapter of Geopolitics. We are fortunate to have a great panel of distinguished speakers, all of whom are accomplished academics, scholars with great reputations. Most of you are joining us today to show solidarity because you understand the 73 years of human misery of Kashmir. Some of you may be new and joining us for the first time to understand the nature of the Kashmir conflict. And all of us will hopefully leave here with better understanding and thus a lasting solidarity with the Kashmiri people. I'll just give you a brief background and let the details be discussed by the scholars. By the way of some background, the conflict, the basis of it is the long tragic occupation, and the audience is not always fully aware of it. Simply stated, the occupied Kashmir was invaded and occupied by India in 1947 after the subcontinent got liberated from the British rule and India and Pakistan got their freedoms. Kashmir was invaded and occupied by the Indians, and Kashmiris have been demanding their right to self-determination, which has been endorsed and passed by United Nations Security Councils on many times, starting in 1948. In 1949, the United Nations Commission on India and Pakistan declared that Kashmiris should have a UN-supervised self-determination with a free and fair plebiscite. That was in 1949, and that's where the right of self-determination day comes. Yet today, more than 70 years later, Indian brutal occupation, military occupation, continuously denies the Kashmiris the right to self-determination. I'd like to defer the details to the distinguished panelists who will explain further. Why is this discussion important? Today is Kashmir's Solidarity Day, along with the Right of Self-Determination Day. It is essential to continually raise awareness on an international scale of the terrible and unwarranted suffering of the people of Kashmir. With the election of President Joe Biden, we have reached an inflection point in US involvement in Kashmir. This panel will dig deep into the opportunities and needs of this current period. About WKA, the World Kashmir Awareness Forum was founded in 2005, its mission being to provide information on the conflict in Kashmir, advocating for Kashmiris in the region and throughout the diaspora. To accomplish its mission, we produce, aggregate, and amplify news articles and even the relevant events of Kashmir. Even events like this one, we organize and anticipate and participate in demonstrations and rallies in the United States and sometimes in collaboration with the Europeans. And we engage in advocacy efforts in diplomatic, civic, religious, human rights, political, and advocacy organizations arenas. Our goal is to expose the human rights abuses perpetrated in Kashmir and supported, we support the region in the right of self-determination. That is the primary goal of Kashmiri struggle. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce the speakers one by one, and then after that, we'll go into their speeches. First of the speaker is Victoria Schofield. She's a British historian, biographer, and historian of major personalities, including Benazir Bhutto. She is author of a book on Benazir Bhutto, a memoir of 30-year friendship with Benazir Bhutto. She is, as I said, she is a scholar and speaker on multiple levels on Kashmir in Europe and elsewhere. She is a graduate of Oxford University, where she met Benazir Bhutto and they were friends. Next speaker is Dr. Raja Kaiser Ahmed. He is the assistant professor of School of Politics and International Relations at the Quaid-e-Azam University in Islamabad, Pakistan. He has a PhD from Quaid-e-Azam University. He did his dissertation on competing discourses in India with impact on policy towards Pakistan at the University of Nottingham. I'll move quickly and then we'll go to Dr. Shubha Ashraf. Shagufta is an educationist, public administrator. She is the department head, banking and finance at Kotli University in Azad Kashmir. She is a participant in ECOSOC, that is United Nations Economic and Social Council, a prestigious position to hold. She has a PhD from Kotli University. Next is Professor Arjun Seti. Professor Seti is a civil rights writer, commentator at multiple TV channels throughout the world, a human rights lawyer, adjunct professor of law at Georgetown University. He is a graduate of Georgetown School of Foreign Services. He is co-author of an op-ed against Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation Award for Narendra Modi. Mirza Saib Beg, he's a lawyer who served as a capital markets lawyer for Indian market regulators, which is just like SEC in the United States, before he moved to England. He is a Kofi Annan Mansfield and Weidenfeld Hoffman Scholar, pursuing his MPP probably for the second time, yes, at Oxford University. He continues his studies there. With that, I'll invite our first speaker, which is Victoria Schofield. She'll speak for 10 minutes, and she will explain what she has done all her busy, fantastic life. Victoria.
Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum to everyone listening in the United States and elsewhere. It's wonderful to be speaking to you. I'm speaking to you from London. So for me, it is afternoon tea time now, but I'm very happy to be talking to you. And I just will explain a little bit about my own passion for Jammu and Kashmir. It began, as Ghulam Nabi Mir has just said, because I met Benazir Bhutto at the University of Oxford. And I went to live in Pakistan, and because of being in Pakistan, I understood that there was the Kashmir issue, and then I went to work for the BBC, and so I went to India to report, and I very much wanted to get really to the bottom of what was the Jammu Kashmir issue, because we sometimes get bound in rhetoric, we get bound in sound bites, particularly now in the modern era. And so I think my plea is to everybody to study and to learn, so that with that learning, we can help actually work towards resolution of the issue, because that is the way forward, it's resolution. And in fact, it's quite appropriate, February 5th, Solidarity Day, because my book, which I first wrote and published in 1996, is just this month out in its 5th edition, not its 2nd edition, but its 5th update. I just received a copy myself, and here it is for you. And it includes an updated chapter on the latest events in Jammu and Kashmir, including the events of 5th of August 2019. I was myself in the Valley of Kashmir shortly before this took place. And so I have wanted to write to keep the book up to date. It is written really from the point of view of a scholar and a historian, but also as a journalist. Most of my research is based on first-hand interviews and first-hand experiences, because again, I think that's what's really important. is to understand what the people who are living in the land we're talking about, and I feel very privileged to talk about it because obviously I'm not a Kashmiri. It's their land, it's their situation, it's their suffering that we have to take into account. And so that has been my life's work. I have actually grown old with the Kashmir issue. I was quite young when I first went to the Valley of Kashmir in 1981. That's when I very first went. But time has gone on. And I think the tragedy of advertising to you a book that's in its 5th edition shows that this issue has just continued and has not been resolved. Things I wrote in the 1990s are still valid, but it's just become more dangerous. And so that is what prompts my passion. Before we talk about resolution, I actually want to talk a little bit about the issue. Nobody condones human rights abuses, and there is absolutely no doubt that human rights abuses have taken place in the Valley of Kashmir. But until we find a resolution, these human rights abuses are going to continue. We talk freely about the Kashmir issue, Kashmir under siege, human rights abuses, Kashmir under lockdown. But as I say, until we focus on what the issue is in the modern day, in 2021, and here it is changed considerably from how it was in 2019, that one has to concede. We're going to continue to have those human rights abuses. And I think that's one of the most tragic aspects, is while you have a situation which is unresolved, you have a high military presence, and inevitably with that high military presence, you have human rights abuses. That goes without saying. So firstly, what is this issue? As I said, more correctly, it's called the Jammu Kashmir issue, because what we're really talking about, and again, I think this is important for students, for shorthand, we do it in the media, we talk about the Kashmir issue, but actual resolution involves the whole of the former princely state of Jammu and Kashmir, established, as we all know, in 1846 by the British in the aftermath of the First Sikh War. So much of our attention is on the Kashmir Valley. It's a narrow strip of land, 80 to 90 miles long, 20 to 25 miles wide. It lies in the heart of the state. It lies in the heart of the issue. This is understandable because, as I said, it's where the main human rights abuses have occurred. And this is the area which is highly militarized, which has crackdowns and curfews. But I can't emphasize strongly enough, if we're going to achieve resolution, we have to look at the whole of the state, of which the Kashmir Valley is only a fraction. As I'm sure you all know, and as Dr. Mir has mentioned, in 1947, the state was contested between India and Pakistan. 1/3 remained under the administration of Pakistan, which is the great area of Gilgit-Baltistan with its massive mountains and a narrow strip of land, which is called Azad, Free Jammu and Kashmir. And then in the Indian side, you have the Valley of Kashmir, the area of Jammu, and also the very large expanse of Ladakh. And so, as I say, when we're talking about resolution, we have to really work out how are India and Pakistan going to be able to sit at the negotiating table and work out a resolution of this issue, which involves and takes into consideration the aspirations of all the inhabitants of this region, some of whom have certain a viewpoint, whether they want to join Pakistan, whether they want to stay with India, whether they want to be independent. And this is where the complexity lies. It does not have a homogeneous will, if you like. And so I think that's why also it's become so intransigent. The one point that I really do want to make in the time I have available, and maybe there will be questions coming afterwards, but currently the narrative, and it's particularly the narrative adopted by India, is that it's a bilateral issue. Well, and they say this because they quote the similar agreement of 1972, which was negotiated between former Prime Minister Indira Gandhi and former Prime Minister Zulfikar Ali Bhutto after the end of the war, the secession of East Pakistan. But I think, and this is very important, especially as we are looking to talk to a new administration in the United States, actually to refer back to the clauses of the similar agreement. And this first clause, which I think is so important, I just want to quote to you. The government of India and government of Pakistan are resolved that the two countries put an end to the conflict and confrontation that have hitherto marred their relations and work for the promotion of a friendly and harmonious relationship and the establishment of durable peace in the subcontinent, so that both countries may henceforth devote their resources and energies to the pressing task of advancing the welfare of their people. Honorable listeners, both countries remain signatories to this statement. The principles, the next clause, that the principles and purposes of the Charter of the United Nations shall govern the relations between the two countries. And this important clause, that the two countries are resolved to settle their differences by peaceful means through bilateral negotiations. And the next really significant clause, or by any other peaceful means mutually agreed upon between them. And this is where I think it's so important to highlight the fact that the narrative has been captured that India and Pakistan agreed to settle their relations bilaterally. They did, but they did not preclude any other peaceful means mutually agreed upon. So this doesn't mean that they can't have, in time of need, a third party, mediator, facilitator. It's a little bit like saying, I'm about to get divorced, but I'm not going to ever use a lawyer. If you can divorce without needing a lawyer, so be it. But if you need a lawyer, if you can't divorce, then you need the lawyer. And I think this is something that in the current day, we must really focus on and look back on. But more importantly, in the light of the 5th of August, 2019, because in relation to Jammu and Kashmir, the clause says, the line of control resulting from the ceasefire of 17th of December 1971, that's which ended the East Pakistan War, shall be respected by both sides without prejudice to the recognized position of either side. Neither side shall seek to alter it unilaterally, irrespective of mutual differences and legal interpretations. Both sides further undertake to refrain from the threat or the use of force in violation of this line. Well, I would like to suggest that what happened on the 5th of August 2019 was in direct violation of this agreement and of this clause. And I think this is something which needs to be highlighted day after day in the media, and certainly in terms of lobbying others who aren't so well informed about the issue, because I'm afraid to say that India has reneged on this treaty to which it remains a signatory, the agreement. And so I think that's very important to bear in mind, and not let other countries, for example, in the United Kingdom or any other countries, say, well, India and Pakistan don't want a mediator, they want to resolve their problems bilaterally. This Shimla agreement does not say that. And so I think, as I say, that's something I particularly want to highlight in the light of 5th of August 2019, because what effectively the Indian government did was preclude any further discussions with Pakistan. More alarmingly, if you look at the statements coming out of the government of India, it has been suggested that their next objective is to take back Azad Jammu and Kashmir and Gilgit-Baltistan. This is very alarmist talk, because that would only trigger another war. And so I think what I would really urge everyone to do is, as I say, number one, read the history, understand the complexities. It isn't simply an issue of what happens in the Kashmir Valley or criticizing human rights abuses. It's an issue of how can we get these two countries back to the negotiating table, including representatives of the state, because clearly no solution imposed upon them will work. But at the same time, no solution will work without the agreement of India and Pakistan, because they're two powerful nuclearized neighbors. How can we get them back to the negotiating table so that the inhabitants of this region can live in peace? They can have rule of law, freedom of speech, freedom of movement, all privileges which we take for granted in the West, wherever we might live. We are very, very fortunate in our lifestyle. And as I say, when I was last in the Valley, which unfortunately I've not been back since 2019 due to the COVID pandemic, it makes your heart break to see young students who, like our students, they want to learn, they want to think about having jobs, they want to think about having careers, and expectations, and to have those expectations curtailed because the schools are shut, they can't complete their studies. It's so difficult when you have a curfew and a lockdown such as they've had to keep. As we know, any student can find it difficult to maintain concentration, but when you've wanting to get on with your studies, you can't take your exams, or the schools, as I say, are closed, and you feel you want to think about what your job's going to be. It's absolutely heartbreaking. These young students deserve all the opportunities that our young students in the Western world deserve. So I think with that, I will close, and thank you all so much for listening. And I really urge you to keep in the forefront, because we might feel depressed, we might feel optimistic, sort of lacking in optimism, but at the same time, it just needs a change of heart, a change of thought, to open the window of opportunity. And when that window of opportunity is opened, we need governments to be ready to move into it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Victoria. It was a great lesson for us today here. Now I'd like to go to Dr. Raja Kaiser Ahmed, who is the Assistant Professor, School of Politics and International Relations, and you heard about him earlier. Raja Kaiser Ahmed, please.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, and a very warm welcome to everyone. It's almost 9:30 p.m. here in Islamabad, Pakistan, and I'm speaking to you all. I'm really thankful to the organizers of the event for giving me this opportunity to speak to you all at this esteemed panel, especially when people like Victoria Schofield are there. So it's always a great learning, and we have been there in Turkey last year as well, and it was indeed very, great learning from her. So today, when we are commemorating it as a Solidarity Day, or we are trying to find the defined or the redefined contours of the self-determination and solidarity in the changing new geopolitics, it is perhaps a little agonizing that by now the Modi-led government has issued 1.5 million domiciles to the Indians to get settled in India and to alter and change the demography and to make Kashmiris aliens in their own lands. Ladies and gentlemen, when we talk of Kashmir, and I myself, who happen to be a Kashmiri and has a very sentimental attachment to this cause, I always get a little taken aback and a little pained when I come across the word dispute with this particular conflict, because a dispute has a territorial connotation. In Kashmir, it does not happen to be a dispute only. It is a conflict. It is a multi-layered conflict which has so many dimensions, which has humanitarian dimensions, which has social, political, and economic dimensions. And all of these things, they need to be put into matrix. So through this forum, I refrain using the word dispute for Kashmir because it is a conflict. So secondly, when I say that it is a conflict, basically it is our right to live with dignity. We, the Kashmiris, have not been able to rule ourselves for the past hundreds of years. Our resistance movement, it does not span over this 1.5 year after the revocation of the Article 370. Neither our resistance movement, it spans over 3 decades after the insurgency of 1989. Nor does our resistance movement start with 1947 in the aftermath of partition. But our resistance movement, it has an unbroken and unstinted lineage of centuries. It's been more than 400 years we Kashmiris have not been able to rule ourselves. So this is the struggle to get the recognition and our right to rule ourselves. It is our right to live with dignity. The right which is enshrined there in the United Nations Basic Charter, which we have been stripped of. There are 9 soldiers being deputed against 1 Kashmiri. This is the alarming reality. And whereas there is 1 doctor against 3,700 Kashmiris. So this is the level of psychological trauma, and this is the level of suffocation we the Kashmiris are living with. And indeed, we are living in the agonizing times. Okay, after the revocation of the Article 370, the international community, it has not outrightly denounced India's blatantly unilateral and grossly illegal step. But we are not surprised with this. Because as the student of international relations, I know a fact that the construct of legality in international politics, it has little to do with justice and it has more to do with power. It is just nearly 100 years when colonialism was legal, when apartheid was legal, when racism was legal and acceptable. If today the world has not come up front denouncing India's egregious human rights violations against us, so we know that we'll have to take this war for at least 1 more generation. We the Kashmiris have nothing left to lose. Our 1 generation, it has died. Our women, they have gotten raped. Our juveniles are picked up and put into incarcerations. Our people, they have been subject to the first mass blinding of human history. If we haven't backed out, or if we haven't given up, it means that we have now nothing left with us. So we know that our existence, it lies in our resistance. And I said that it is the war, or it is a struggle which goes for last centuries, for last so many centuries. We will continue to resist. Another alarming thing which I would like to draw the attention of the panelists and to all the people who are listening, at that how Indians, they are changing the demography using the banking laws. That the people who have taken loans from the banks in Jammu and Kashmir and who could not pay back those loans because for last 2 years, the economic activity in Jammu and Kashmir is almost virtually zero. And those lands, when they were being pledged to the banks, by then the state subject rule was intact. Now banks, they are deliberately shifting those lands to non-Kashmiris to alter the demography. The settler colonialism is ubiquitous. India is up to raise a Gaza-like situation in Kashmir. And the international community acts like a spectator. Genocide alert has given a caution for an impending genocide. The Amnesty International has released 2 reports which has reaffirmed and substantiated the gross and egregious human rights violations committed against Kashmiris. Ladies and gentlemen, India considers Kashmir as a litmus test for its great power status. And I must say that Kashmir also happens to be a test case for the conscience of international community. It is a test case for those people who believe in creating a just international society. It is also a litmus test for the liberal ideals who believe in egalitarian, who believe in an equal and a just law-based society. It's not just 1.5 years we are in a siege. We are in a persistent siege. And we are in a persistent siege for centuries. We have been constantly subjugated by the invaders. And we haven't given up. So this is, and now the issue has taken a quantum leap forward on August 5th, 2019, when the last thing which was left with the Kashmiris, and that was their exclusive identity, that too has been abrogated, rescinded, and repealed. Situation is alarming, and it is more and even beyond agonizing. The international community has to come up front. It's not just about India's robust diplomatic and economic clout. It is more about, it is not even about the land. The discussion and deliberation should not be Kashmir. It should now be Kashmiris. It is not a territorial dispute. It is neither a religious one. It is a dispute which concerns 20 million Kashmiris. And I repeat, their right to live with dignity and their right to rule themselves. There is a dire need for an indigenous inclusive narrative in this entire scenario. Let me conclude by saying, which I read somewhere in a novel, that you can build all the walls till sky, but I'll still manage to find a way to fly above them. You can pin me down with thousands of arms, but I'll still get up and I'll resist it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Raja Kaiser. Thank you so much for bringing up the Kashmir situation in front of the world. Let's go now to Dr. Shubha Ashraf. She is an educationist, a public administrator, and department head at University of Kotli. She will be addressing the question of women and children of the Indian occupied Kashmir and what the world community must do for them. Dr. Shubha Ashraf, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Shubha Ashraf and I live in Kotli Azad Kashmir, which is just 12 kilometers away from line of control. So there is a little weak connectivity. So
We can't,
hello?
we cannot see you, but we can hear you.
Okay. Firstly, I would like to thank you, the organizers of this webinar, for organizing this. Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator, for having me on this very important day, Solidarity Day, with people of particularly Indian occupied Kashmir. I'm really grateful that you're organizing this conference on the evening of Solidarity Day, but there is a dire need of organizing such kind of conferences and activities each day of the year, because this is the right time, I must say, for raising voice for the oppressed and suppressed and voiceless Kashmiris in Indian occupied Kashmir. the Solidarity Day, I mean, what kind of Solidarity Day it is when I am throughout the day, I see bullets, I see pallets, I see men, women, and children crying. I see grand farewells. I see tributes. I see resistance. I see resilience whole day. I mean, it's a moment that maybe at a time I feel that I'm so helpless that maybe I'm failed to give awareness to the international community, UN, and world powers, what is happening with the people of Indian occupied Kashmir, particularly after August 5, 2019. So, dear listeners, each year people around the globe celebrates February 5 as a Solidarity Day with oppressed and suppressed people of Jammu and Kashmir. The primary focus of this solidarity is the people of Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir, who have suffered massive human rights violations at the hands of Indian occupation forces ever since 1990. For the second time, Kashmir Solidarity Day is being celebrated in a changed environment, where Kashmiris of Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir are still under detention and siege after India unilaterally and illegally changed its status on August 5, 2019. This is yet another criminal act of Indian government. People around the globe who supports Kashmiris and particularly the government of Pakistan are celebrating solidarity with Kashmiris. And I believe that after attaining 5 objectives, which I am going to share with you, after attaining these 5 objectives, Solidarity Day means would be nothing to the people of Indian occupied Kashmir, because these are the 5 objectives. Without attaining these 5 objectives, the situation of the people of Indian occupied Kashmir would remain same. Number 1, the restoration of pre-August 5, 2019 special status of Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir. Number 2, emphasizing India to stop human rights violations in Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir. Number 3, stressing India to stop changing demography of Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir. Number 4, creating an awareness among international community about unresolved nature of Kashmir conflict. Number 5, stressing UN, major superpowers, that these international bodies are still lacking in implementation of UN Security Council's resolutions on Kashmir and giving Kashmiris their inalienable right of self-determination. These are the 5 objectives, according to my point of view, Mr. Moderator. We feel that this is what the dire need of the time to put people out of that situation, that intense and aggravated situation which they have been facing after particularly August 5. Apart from massive human rights violations by Indian occupation forces, the occupied state has been in a state of constant curfew and siege since August 5. The Kashmiri freedom leadership is still in jails or else under house arrest, while the masses are facing the situation of an open prison in extreme cold winter where there's a freezing temperature in the valley. Thousands of Kashmiris have been killed, detained, tortured, injured, maimed, blinded, raped, gang raped since August 5, 2019. Besides, thousands of Kashmiri youth are still in Indian prisons outside the state boundaries in other parts of India. Indeed, the abrogation of Articles 370 and 35A was meant to rehabilitate the non-Kashmiri Hindus in Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir, especially in the Valley of Kashmir. In this regard, Hindu nationalist paramilitary volunteer of RSS, youth wing of Bajrang Dal, the religious Hindu militant organization, of the Vishwa Hindu Parishad stationed in various parts of Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir to terrorize Kashmiri masses and help settlement of non-Kashmiri Hindus from all over India. These terrorists have been found in killing the Kashmiri youth, torching the houses and raping the women folk of Kashmir. These terrorist groups have been given total impunity by BJP government in the gab of union territories in the occupied state. Prolonging the siege in Indian illegally occupied Jammu and Kashmir is basically aims at settling non-Kashmiri Hindus in the valley of Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir. Over the last 7 decades, Kashmiris didn't reconcile with Indian rule over their state and revolted many a time against forceful Indian occupation. During the ongoing freedom struggle started in 1990, more than 100,000 Kashmiris have lost their lives at the hands of the brutal Indian forces. Indian Army and its paramilitary forces are still continuing with their brutalities in the land, taking cover of black laws like Armed Forces Special Power Act, Public Safety Act, and many more. Despite heavy Indian forces deployment in Indian occupied Kashmir, it couldn't defeat the will of the Kashmiris for the attainment of their right of self-determination. Thus, forcefully and finally, eventually, illegally, they tried to change the status of Indian occupied Kashmir. Ladies and gentlemen, there is an organized campaign of genocide going on in Indian occupied Kashmir, and we need to really understand the philosophy and doctrine behind this particular act. This is indeed the darkest aspect of India, which international community, major powers, and UN are constantly ignoring. Through Kashmir Solidarity Day, I'm emphasizing particularly UN, major superpowers, and international community to come forward to stand for Kashmiris' legitimate right of self-determination and the UN mandated right of self-determination, I must say. Let there be no more discrimination. Let there be no more human rights violations against innocent, unarmed Kashmiris. What they are asking for, just keeping all the countries which we say that they would decide our destiny, let them aside. Just think for a moment, why Kashmiris? Why human rights can easily be taken for granted when it comes to Kashmir? And we are looking forward that this country would come forward, that country would come forward, this country would mediate. Why Kashmiris? What is their fault? We need peace. We really want to decide our future by our own. So the only option which Kashmiris want to exercise is their right of referendum, plebiscite. If for East Timor they can do it, for Christians, for other countries they can do it, why not for Kashmiris? Why we are looking for others to resolve our dispute? This is indeed the darkest aspect of India, and I'm emphasizing because they can actually stand for by lobbying, by educating, by providing the real education awareness. What is the legitimate status of Jammu and Kashmir? I think that we would definitely be successful in raising our voice for the peaceful settlement of Jammu and Kashmir dispute. All roads to peace in South Asia pass through Kashmir, and the superpowers and the UN and all other should keep this thing very clearly in mind, because peace in Kashmir will ensure peace in the entire region. It is not like that we will keep on dying, we'll keep on watching our kids to be burned, to be killed, to be raped, to be blinded, to be maimed, and the other people of the world would live in a peaceful environment. This is what absolutely not possible. Kashmiris will never accept Indian annexation of occupied Kashmir. Since Kashmir is not part of India, the only and only way forward for a peace in this nuclearized region is the restoration of special status of occupied Kashmir and granting right of self-determination to people of Jammu and Kashmir as per UN resolutions, the framework provided by Security Council. They kill us, they bury us, they rape us, they blind us, they maim us, and they are peace brigade. We mourn and we disrupt peace. How it is legitimate for entire world? Why they do not consider Kashmiris as a human being? This is what the question. And I request, because all the excellencies sitting over here, most of them belongs to Kashmiri. So there is a need of standing up for us, the international community. If international community, what they have been doing for the last 2 days on Solidarity Day, if they would keep on doing the same each day of the year, I'm sure that we would be successful in having our right to self-determination. Thank you very much for inviting me once again, and over to you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you, Dr. Shubha Ashraf, for your wonderful words. Let us go now to Professor Arjun Seti. As you know, he's an adjunct professor of law at Georgetown University, and his work and words will speak for themselves. He's here for us, and we appreciate your visit with us today, Dr. Arjun Seti.
Hi there, you can see and hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. So thank you so much for having me. I want to focus my remarks today on advocacy and what are the things we can do to continue to elevate the issue of Kashmir in the international community. I want to start the conversation by framing it just with 3 observations. First, despite the fact that it's 2021, we live in a period of rising authoritarianism, fascism, and human rights atrocity. And so it's just important to remember that while we believe in human rights, and while the UN Declaration of Human Rights is now many decades old, the challenges that we face in the field are arguably greater today than they were even 10, 15 years ago. So the entire field as a whole is under threat. 2, we've also seen that a lot of international organizations have not been able to do the work that they were entrusted to. And so, for example, if you look at Kashmir, if you look at Palestine, if you look at the war in Yemen, and you think about the role of international bodies like the United Nations, at times they can be helpful, at times they can be persuasive, but in the world of real politics, state power, often their work ends up also being ineffectual. 3, we also live in a world of extraordinary propaganda, fake news, and viral media. And the truth is, very few countries have mastered that better than India. India has a fake news empire. You're seeing it now with respect to what's happening with the farmer protests. You saw it last year with respect to the Delhi program and the CAA NRC. And of course, we've seen it throughout the years with Kashmir. And so with those observations in mind, here's some recommendations on how I think we can and should move forward. 1, I think it's really important to just document and archive what is actually happening in Kashmir. And there is no question that there are a lot of people who've done that work with respect to extrajudicial killings, the PSA, the Public Safety Act, the mass blindings. And I would just encourage folks and activists to continue to emphasize and do that work, because again, we live in a world where the truth itself is under assault. And so while we may know what's happening there, when people are inundated with fake news and the like, it's just that much more important to document what is actually happening in Kashmir. 2, I think we need to be thinking about opportunities for international solidarity. And so one thing I've seen in the last few years is, people talking about the similarities, differences too, but between Kashmir and Gaza. talking about the similarities between the mass blindings that we've seen in Kashmir and Chilean protesters being blinded by rubber bullets, pellet bullets as well. And so I do think there's an opportunity for international solidarity when thinking about colonization, the settler colonial complex, and also just thinking about international violence and the different ways that it manifests. I think in India, we also should have a conversation about what solidarity looks like. And I know this is challenging, right? Because as many people have said in recent days and in recent years, if only we had heard the cries of the Kashmiri people. Because the truth is, there are folks in India today who are starting to experience just a fraction of what Kashmiris have experienced for decades. And it's painful to know that so many in India have turned their backs. So many in India have justified the atrocities that have happened in Kashmir and the like. That said, I do think there's an opportunity today for solidarity within India on these broader issues. So when we think about Hindutva, when we think about Hindutva nationalism, when we think about BJP, RSS, and we think about CAA, NRC, the anti-Muslim program that took place last year, and of course what's happening now with the farmers' protests, and even just the international condemnation we are seeing in this moment, we have to make sure that we connect that to Kashmir. Whether again, it's internet blackouts, right? The longest blackout ever imposed in the digital era was the blackout that Kashmir endured last year. Whether it's the chilling of religious freedoms, the expanse of draconian national security laws and the ways in which they're used to imprison young people and the like. I think we should talk about the connection between Kashmir and some of what's happening in India today and the broader US racial justice movement. The truth is that there is a greater appetite, I think, at the grassroots level, and even in some cases at sort of higher levels, to talk about civil and human rights, in part because of what the United States just experienced last summer with the murder, or really truthfully, the lynching of George Floyd. And so I do think that there are activists inside the racial justice movement, and I've seen it myself, I see it on social media, I see it elsewhere, who are looking for direction on how they can engage these issues. And one talking point that I'd love to bring up, I always say, if you organized against Trump, organize against Modi. If you organize against white supremacy, organize against Hindutva nationalism. Because Kashmir is part of that project, right? The annexation of Kashmir, the revocation of autonomy, the mass suspension of civil and human rights is part of the Hindutva project. Yes, it's been going on for a long time, but I think the acceleration and intensification that we've seen in the last few years is very much connected with that agenda. And then I think in terms of the sort of legislative side here in the US, I think there's a lot of things that can be done. I think we can pass local resolutions. And so we saw several local resolutions passed in places like Seattle, where local officials condemned the NRC, CAA, and condemned some of the atrocities happening in Kashmir. That's important because a lot of those local legislators have persuasive power. It sends a symbolic message. And here's the thing, right? When you share it online, when you put it on social media, it'll be attacked. And you'll have people who say, oh, these are internal affairs, or they'll say you're bought, you're paid, nobody cares what a local legislator says. The truth is they do care. They do, because if they didn't care, they wouldn't bother trolling those local officials. They wouldn't bother actually ridiculing us for actually doing that work. And again, I think that's also connected with this idea of just educating and informing people. The truth is, I wish people knew what was happening in Kashmir long before the last few years. But the fact is, a lot of people have only just learned about the struggle there. And I think that is an opportunity that we just have to use to sort of engage more people, educate more people, and just keep them informed. On the congressional side, we had a hearing last year, or a couple years ago, with the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission. There was also a House Foreign Relations Committee hearing. I think those hearings are important. I think we should aspire to have a Senate Foreign Relations Committee hearing on India today, And as part of that conversation, we have to talk about Kashmir. And we need a Kashmiri human rights voice to speak to so much of what you all have addressed today. These human rights atrocities that have been going on really for generations, and again have accelerated in the last few years. We need to engage the State Department. And so, for example, the State Department put out a statement just a couple of days ago about the farmers' protest that was, you know, I thought a bit haphazard, right? It talked about the importance of having internet and the importance of journalistic freedom, but also sort of equivocated on the actual laws. And so I do think we need to continue to pressure the State Department. I think the State Department, it's high time that they designate India a country of particular concern. You can designate a country of particular concern under RFRA on account of a country not being mindful of sort of religious freedom issues. And so it's a big deal if the US charges India in that way. And I think that that would be a very welcome intervention, and an intervention that others could follow. You know, the last point I'll make again is in terms of thinking about lobbying and advocacy is just to kind of reiterate, we are literally witnessing in so many ways all of the contradictions of India sort of coalescing at the exact same moment. Whether it's the internet blackouts, whether it's journalists not being able to publish freely, whether it's them censoring social media accounts, whether it's the revocation of autonomy of Kashmir, the farmer laws. And there is, I said this, I tweeted this a few days ago, can you feel it? The whole world is watching India. And so I just think now is an opportunity to talk about what's happened in Kashmir and to truthfully learn about what's happened from Kashmir. I tell local activists in India all the time, reach out to people in Kashmir because they will give you the playbook, right? Because they have experienced the hardship, they've experienced the struggle, the ugly side of Hindutva nationalism in ways that few have. And so I think we have a lot to learn from the Kashmiri experience. I think the Kashmiri experience can help guide this moment. And I think the Kashmiri struggle is part of a broader struggle within India and a broader human rights struggle for liberation and freedom.
Thank you, Professor Seti. It's wonderful discussing the diasporic activity and how we must address the Kashmir issue along with solidarity from other organizations. Thank you. We'd like to ask Mirza Saib Beg to speak. Mirza Saib Beg, I didn't say it all earlier, is a Kashmiri lawyer, of course. He is the first Kashmiri Kofi Annan scholar at Mansfield College, Oxford, and Weidenfeld Hoffman Scholar at the Blavatnik School of Government, University of Oxford, England. And he's going to be speaking primarily on the use of legislation in India over Kashmir to suppress political demands of Kashmiris. And we're happy to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. So over the next few minutes, I will quickly discuss legislation that is being used to suppress political demands of Kashmiris, most notably the UAPA, the PSA, and if there's time, I'll touch upon delimitation as well. But if not, we can touch that in the Q&A. I won't be dealing with domicile law right now because Raja Saab has already spoken about it before me. So I just want to make three main points right now. That the first is on the state of exception in which Kashmir indefinitely exists. And the second is on the experience of Kashmiris under the UAPA, because we have to document and discuss what is taking place and how arbitrarily these laws are used to suppress Kashmiris. And finally, I want to touch upon the banning of social and political organizations in Kashmir. So when we talk about suppression of political demands, one thing that stands out in Kashmir is that there is not a single political group in Kashmir whose demands have been accepted by the government of India. Even the pro-India led, the pro-India groups that are the National Conference or the PDP, they have also faced only failure in this regard. So the question that arises then is that whose demands is the government of India executing in Kashmir? Because it is clear that the decisions taken by the Indian government do not represent any shade of political opinion in Kashmir. So then how are they able to execute these decisions when they have no legitimacy? And the answer to this lies in the structure of laws that are used to suppress the political resistance of Kashmiris when the decisions that are taken are against our will and against our consent. So laws like AFSPA, the Armed Forces Special Powers Act, the Public Safety Act, the PSA, or the UAPA, the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, if at all these laws have to exist, they can only exist temporarily in any society in a state of emergency, when exceptions to reasonable standards of justice can be acceptable, even though such exceptions are still undesirable. And of course, I'm not justifying these laws, but merely explaining the legal jurisprudence that could allow for such a situation. And this has to be a case of extreme peril to the state. There has to be, because there is a certain juridical order which defines the thresholds, it defines the limits of the law. But in case of extreme peril, that order can be suspended temporarily. But in Kashmir, the situation is such that we have had these laws like AFSPA, PSA, UAPA, we have had these laws for decades now. And it indicates that constitutional exceptionalism, which is aimed at suspending the rights of Kashmiris, this has become a regular part of daily lives over there. This has become a regular tool of governance. And this essentially was what India would call the special status of Kashmir. In my entire life, I have never experienced any period of time when emergency laws are not in place in Kashmir. So legally speaking, we are in a state of indefinite emergency. And as we have seen in the last 1 year, we live in a situation where people are arrested and jailed for thoughts, not just for action, but for having thoughts which the state does not like. Terror charges are imposed on a cricket tournament. Journalists can be charged with terrorism for reporting the news. And lawyers are being jailed without any legal charge against them. And thousands of people have been incarcerated under various preventive detention laws without any trial, which has gone on now for decades. So all these laws are used because there is no tolerance of any dissent against the state. There is no tolerance against any dissent against the tremendous economic exploitation, the militarization, the egregious human rights violations, which have been going on for decades now. Because I'm the last speaker, I thought that it would be interesting to share some data which will make this a more engaging discussion. So I just want to touch upon some laws which are being used to suppress when any kind of dissent is expressed by Kashmiris, and how cautiously we have to navigate the situation in which we are. So the first thing I wanted to discuss was the sedition law. And as you can see, the sedition law is used extensively against all forms of dissent. But if you were to compare Manmohan and Modi, the two past governments that we have had, neither, this is not to show that one has been more benevolent than the other, but both have extensively used sedition law to suppress any kind of critical remarks against the government, against political leaders. Manmohan Singh has used the sedition law in 3,762 cases in a span of 4 years. This is roughly about 3 to 4 cases of sedition every single day. And the Modi government has used it nearly double the number that was used earlier. And more recently, just after the Pulwama attack, there were 27 cases of sedition which were imposed, and 41 people had been arrested under this. So quickly, in the next few minutes, I just want to touch upon a few main points. One is I want to show how these laws they are designed to impose incarceration. They are designed to keep people in jail. So one statistic that I want to discuss is how 90% of the inmates in Jammu and Kashmir jails, they are all under trial prisoners. They are not convicts. They are under trial who have been in jail now for decades. Less than 2% of the individuals who have been arrested in militancy-related cases, less than 2% have been convicted. So this gives you an idea of how arbitrarily people are kept incarcerated in Kashmir. The next, I want to give you 3 quick examples of the UAPA to show you how arbitrarily, how the UAPA can be extended to anything the state deems undesirable. One example is the UAPA, which was imposed on young boys who are playing cricket. The second example is on UAPA being imposed for accessing the internet. When the social media sites were banned in Kashmir, anyone who accessed social media sites, whether by using a VPN, a secure server, or any other means, a blanket imposition of UAPA had been put on them. This is an anti-terror legislation which is being used. And finally, I want to touch upon the ban on JKLF and Jamaat under the UAPA, which was imposed in the last year, 2 years ago. So I'll just quickly touch upon these few points and just remove the slides from there so I can discuss this. So to contextualize first the UAPA, this is a law which was passed in 1967, and this was a time when India had come out of two wars, the 1965 war and the war with China, the short brief exchange with China, which saw clashes at Nathula and Chola. So this law has sweeping powers, and it was enacted in a situation where the state would be at war with a foreign country. But now it has been used in a manner which normalizes its utilization, its imposition in everyday life. And the experience of Kashmiris has been that the objective of this law is just to keep us incarcerated. Now, whether you are guilty or not, you will be in jail for years, because under section 43D of the UAPA, if you are charged under this law, you will not be released on bail, even if the evidence against you is blatantly unreasonable. This is what the act itself is stating. Now, this is the essential difference between how the UAPA works and how the PSA works. Because even though both are essentially doing the same thing, the PSA orders, the Public Safety Act orders, they routinely get quashed by the court. But the mechanism of incarceration under PSA is to reissue new orders when one is quashed, thereby resulting in effective detention for many, many years. But procedurally speaking, you can get a PSA order quashed. You cannot get a UAPA order quashed. You cannot get bail under UAPA. So the interesting thing that one should note over here is that in PSA cases, 80% of the cases are dismissed because the procedure under PSA itself is not followed. Now, what this means is that the PSA, which is an already draconian law, which has an already draconian procedure, even that established procedure is not followed. But even to get the order passed on procedural grounds, even to get it dismissed on procedural grounds, it takes at least 2 to 3 months for the court to do so. So now, because the reporting on Public Safety Act, the international media reporting and international activism on Public Safety Act has been quite intense. The Amnesty has called it a lawless law. So there's been significant visibility of the use and abuse of Public Safety Act. So therefore, because of this bad press, the government is now resorting to UAPA. And this is where I feel the international community plays a big role in highlighting exactly what are the tools of incarceration, what are the tools that are used to quell political resistance in Kashmir. So we have to highlight these specific instances. Now, with the UAPA, the other form of harassment is that there are only 3 special courts for UAPA. So people have to travel for hundreds of kilometers to reach these courts, and it makes it harder for lawyers as well as family members to meet them. And as I mentioned earlier, that according to data which has just recently been accessed by some law students from Kashmir University, of all the people who are arrested for militancy related charges, only 14 people have been convicted till date. This is a conviction rate of less than 1.8%. A staggering number, a staggering 90% of the total prisoners who are lodged in Kashmir are still undergoing trial. And in many cases, they've been in jail for 15 to 20 years. In some cases, even after decades of punishment, they are found not guilty, they are found innocent. Now, the examples that I was discussing on cricket and those other 2 examples, the first is an example of Jammu, who is a 24-year-old brother of a militant, Sayyid Ruban. Ruban was killed in 2018, and when he was alive, he had been a cricketer of certain repute at his village. And after his death, his fellow cricketers, they used to play with him. So they offered funeral prayers in his memory, and they played a game of cricket. Now, about a month later, these boys who played the match, they were charged under the UAPA. Now, offering funeral prayers, offering Fatiha for any deceased person, this is performance of an act of religious belief. It cannot be a criminal or unlawful act. Now, whether playing cricket in the memory of an armed rebel, whether it's a good idea or a bad idea, that's a different debate. But to charge these people under an anti-terrorism law, under which a person can be designated a terrorist and jailed for up to 7 years, to charge them with this for playing cricket or for offering players is an absolutely arbitrary application of an already severe law with extremely drastic consequences. The second example is on and the reason I'm giving you these examples is to show you how Kashmiris are at the whims of the administrative authority that is governing them. And this example highlights it, because when last year the internet had been banned in Kashmir, after 6 months of ban, the government allowed Kashmiris to access only 300 websites. And these websites did not, the whitelisted websites, they do not include social media sites. But ironically, they included Netflix and Amazon Prime when we barely had a functioning 2G speed connection. So at that time, the UAPA was invoked against anyone who uses the social media, anyone who defies the government's internet ban. And in this case, the police did not even question whether access to internet was being used for an unlawful activity or not. There was no need to establish that the accused social media users have caused fear or they've incited violence or they've violated the law in any way. So an absolutely egregious application over there. So this is because the way the UAPA is designed, it can bring anything into its purview. And I can give you past examples of SIMI, where UAPA had been implemented to give you an idea of how this can affect in Kashmir in light of the JKLF and Jamaat being banned now under the UAPA. So SIMI is the Students Islamic Movement of India, and in that case, see, you can never prove whether someone is a member of an organization or not, because people don't sign a letter or an affidavit to say that, yes, I'm a member of such and such organization. So in SIMI cases, police used to rely on possession of literature. So if you have any literature published by SIMI, such as a pamphlet, maybe some promotional material, any book material, any reading material, the police would rely on this to establish that you are a member of SIMI. So effectively, the police was making the argument that just reading a provocative thought is now illegal. So a provocative thought ipso facto becomes evidence justifying punishment, even though there are multiple judgments of courts, even the Supreme Court, which has said that books, slogans, diary entries, these things cannot be used as evidence for UAPA. But people are routinely arrested under UAPA for such flimsy evidence. They are kept incarcerated for many, many years, even before the court can arrive at a determination that these charges do not stand. And one prominent example is of Jason Cooper, who was arrested in 2015 under the UAPA. And the only evidence against him was that a book was found in his home, which was titled Why Maoism. So if we now apply this example or these precedents of how the police has interpreted and implemented UAPA, if you apply that to Kashmir, in 2019, the JKLF was banned under the UAPA, and the Jamaat had been banned just some time before this. Now, since 1994, the JKLF has decided to pursue non-violent means for their political goals. And today, JKLF does not advocate for violence against the state, but it does espouse a political ideology for Kashmir, which the Indian state does not agree with. So while the Indian state may find it undesirable, they may find this political ideology undesirable, people cannot be charged with terrorism for a political ideology. And if I were to apply the verdict of the Kerala High Court in Shyam Balakrishna's case, I've tried to minimize the legal jargon in today's discussion because I wanted this to be for a wider audience. But I'm just citing one example, one case where specifically, if we look at the judgment of Justice Muhammad Mushtaq, one can infer from that espousing a political ideology regarding any dispute, any political question, it is not illegal, even if this ideology does not synchronize with India's constitutional polity, because it is not illegal to have divergent thoughts. It's a basic human right to think in terms of human aspirations. The freedom of thought, the liberty of conscience, these are natural rights. They cannot be surrendered by a human being to the state. These are not freedoms that the state has given us. These are freedoms which are ingrained in the human mind and soul. Therefore, the state cannot detain people merely because we have thoughts that the state does not like. So in conclusion, I would just say that these are laws that are destroying lives in a most arbitrary and most discretionary manner. And we need to continue to exert pressure by documenting and emphasizing how these laws prevent the truth from coming out in Kashmir. And of course, we have to talk about all aspects of the Kashmir dispute, but we also have to highlight specific examples and specific cases because we have to elaborate on the tools that are used for oppression. And only then can this be dismantled one by one, because international actors and international the non-governmental organizations that will put pressure on these points, they can pinpoint that this is wrong and this needs to go. And this enables us to take the discussion one step further at a time. I'll be happy to answer any questions on anything else that you'd want to address. I think this is all that I want to cover right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Saibeg. I know we are running a little bit over time now. So inshallah, we'll go straight into the question answer. We have 3 questions that we'll probably be able to address. because we like to close this session by 12:45. So that'll be a limitation here. But let me ask the question in this manner. I'll ask question number one, and we'll start with one speaker, and then the others will then follow up. So it'll be about a 5-minute question, and everybody will have to be, confining themselves within that short period. And then I'll ask the second question the same way. All 5 speakers can answer that, and then question number 3, and then if we have time, we can answer some questions from the guests in the conference. So to start out, the first question is, if you can remember the question is, if you could give one major policy recommendation to President Biden to combat human rights violations in Kashmir, what would it be? And I'm going to start with Professor Arjun Seti, because he is in Washington, D.C., and he's close to the government. Please go ahead, and then we'll follow the other speakers who can start answering, or I can call upon them. Professor Seti?
It's such a hard question, because as the panelists today have established, there are so many atrocities happening there. I think for me, it would probably just be the right to life. We've seen so many extrajudicial killings in Kashmir that I think just focusing on basic human rights protections like due process, use of lethal force, rights during confinement are imperative and would save lives.
Great, thank you. Victoria Schofield, please address the question if you can.
Well, yes, thank you so much. I'd like to address it in the broadest terms possible, which reflects my comments earlier, that the major policy recommendation to President Biden to stop human rights abuses is to force India to address the issue and to really put the spotlight on its unilateral action, that it's gone way beyond what it should have done. If you refer, as I said, back to Shimla, or even back to 1947, 48, 49, because as again I've said, there will continue to be human rights abuses while the issue remains unresolved. And it is, I know, looking at the bigger picture, but this has been going on for so long. And I suppose because I've been documenting it, and I absolutely agree with Mirza, we've shared panels before, that documentation, because you need to be ready. And I think all the comments of all the panelists in terms of what those human rights abuses are, is an armory of literature which needs to be put in front of the UN human rights everywhere. But if I had that opportunity to meet President Biden and make a recommendation, it would be absolutely enough's enough with the whole issue. It's caused so much suffering to so many people. Right to life, right to dignity, right to freedom of movement, freedom of speech, all the liberties we take for granted, quite apart from the fact the peoples of South Asia can't afford what's happening because both armies, India and Pakistan, face each other across the line of control, bristling with armies or the international frontier, but they're on a demographic time bomb themselves. They're running out of water. They need poverty eradication, development, all these things. They may be nuclear powers, but the majority of their people live in poverty. They certainly can't boast adult literacy. So I'm afraid if I had myself in front of President Biden, I would really push for the bigger picture, resolution of the issue once and for all. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let's ask Dr. Shubha Ashraf. We got 1 minute for you and 1 minute for Raja Kaiser, and then Mirza Saib there.
Thank you, Ghulam Nabi Saab. I would straight away suggest my one clause, but that would definitely have 2 parts, because there is urgent need to stop human rights violations being perpetrated by Indian occupation forces in Indian occupied Jammu and Kashmir. So by doing this, the next part would be to uphold the legal sanctity of UN Security Council's resolutions on Jammu and Kashmir. I think immediately he should go for for stopping the human rights violations and putting pressure on India to stop human rights violations, and then the peaceful settlement of Jammu and Kashmir dispute under the framework of UN Security Council's resolutions. This is what my input on the question. Thank you
so much. Let's go to Mirza Saib Beg, and then we'll go to Raja Kaiser.
Thank you. I think the speakers before me have very eloquently addressed all the important things that would need to be covered by a policy decision towards Kashmir. There isn't much that I can add to that, but I'll just say this much, that I would say that you have to move towards decriminalizing political expression. Right now, political expression in Kashmir is criminal. So if we discuss exactly what the people's will is, it is criminal to discuss that. So decriminalization of political expression is essential. And one thing which was said earlier by Raja Saab in the discussion, which I liked, is that you have to move towards talking about Kashmiris and not just about Kashmir. So because that's the essential, that at the end of the day, it does not matter what happens to Kashmir, it matters what happens to Kashmiris. That's what the struggle is about. And we have to be the final arbiters of this dispute. So that centralization of Kashmiris to take our narrative forward in whatever space we have, wherever it is available, that is essential. So I think these are the only 2 points I can add to everything that has been said till now.
I think what we'll do, because we are running out of time, we're not too badly, but I think we did go over time. So we can skip the next question for Dr. Raja Kaiser and make him the answer of the second question first. That is, what is an aspect of the crisis in Kashmir that you think needs more global attention? What isn't talked about enough? So what should the world talk about more that it's not talking about? Raja Kaiser Ahmed. Oh, yeah, you unmute yourself.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Ghulam Nabi Saab. Yeah, indeed, I would rather say that it is the responsibility to protect the commitment which the United Nations has consensually agreed in 2005. I think that is perhaps the most under-discussed thing in this entire scenario. This is the responsibility of the international community to save the Kashmiris, because this is not what myself, Victoria Schofield, or Mirza Saib Beg, or Professor Arjun Seti is saying, that Kashmiris are under the threat of a genocide. This is rather being said by the most authentic world body on this particular topic. The genocide alert is saying. So when there is an impending genocide, so I think the international community has to come up front, and it's ensuring its commitment to protect the humanity. So this right and responsibility to protect norm of the United Nations, I think it needs to be taken into consideration first. And secondly, I would go what Mr. Saib Beg has said, that the international community has to ensure that the Kashmiris, they are not the children of lesser God. They do have the same kind, they merit and they deserve the same treatment like the other global citizens of the world. So they are not the subhumans. They should be treated as dignity and should be treated at par with all other citizens of the world. So I would rather say that these two things, they are perhaps under noticed, or I would like the world to draw more attention onto these things. That one, that Kashmiris, they are under threat in the garb of the settler colonialism. This change in demography is likely to raise a Gaza-like situation, and then there would be sorry state of affairs. And secondly, the impending genocide and the commitment of the world to protect Kashmiris, I think that should be discussed.
Thank you. Victoria, would you like to give about a few seconds to this question?
Sorry, this is the UN.
The crisis in the Kashmir that you think needs more global attention, what's not talked about enough?
Well, again, I think it is the resolution. I think we have had reports on human rights abuses. I know that we are concerned about human rights abuses, but as I say, until the issue is resolved, these human rights abuses will continue. And I think the international community, be it the United States, possibly the United Kingdom, because we've had a long-standing interest. We have a lot of Kashmiris who live in the United Kingdom, or other countries, disinterested parties like Norway can put pressure and call a spade in terms of what will stop these human rights abuses, and it will be resolution of the issue, because otherwise I'm afraid we're going to be sitting here in years to come. And I totally endorse everything every other speaker has said in terms of the right to lead lives like we live. We are so privileged, and we can talk about it, but go to the place and see the people suffering. Certainly they're not children of a lesser God. I would absolutely emphasize they're magnificent individuals, just like anybody else. They want life, they want liberty, pursuit of happiness, they want to have marriages, they want to have children, they want to be able to rejoice. You, Dr. Meera, sitting against the backdrop of Dal Lake, it's one of the most beautiful places in the world, yet they cannot enjoy that freely. With always the fear of lockdown and curfew. And it's particularly for the young men, but the women suffer as well, because we know that the women, they're half widows, quite apart from the fact of rape, the orphans, the children who've lost their parents, the psychological trauma of living as they've been living for the past at least 30 years has not been properly measured. It's not been properly documented, but I do know people who have brought in psychiatrists to Kashmir, and it is far, far worse than you would imagine, because people have been brought up in trauma. And that's why I mentioned the young students who feel they want to study, but it affects them. I mean, we have depression in our societies. So imagine what it is like to have depression in that society. So I can't emphasize enough how it's no good to keep just sort of batting the issue back and forward or in different capital cities. It's what will bring a peaceful resolution of this issue. Both, as I said, it can't be divided up. It's not like, it is not a piece of real estate. It is about people. And I'd like to assure Raja Kaiser that in my book, I very much made the point, it's a conflict, it's not a dispute. And please look at the book and you'll see that, because that's what the Kashmiris said to me. You cannot talk about it as a dispute because we, the Kashmiris, are in it. It's a conflict. So that is what I would say.
Yeah. Let's go to the third question, and we'll like to probably have only one or two individuals, panelists speak onto that. And Professor Seti, being in the United States and doing the diasporic advocacy, how can international sympathizers best advocate for human rights in Kashmir? Question to you.
Sorry, the question got cut off. I didn't hear the whole question.
How can international sympathizers best advocate for human rights in Kashmir?
There's a lot, right? I think working with local legislators to pass resolutions is important. Working with national legislatures is important. Contacting human rights bodies is important. I think, as Mirza pointed out, right, we've got to listen and learn and hear from Kashmiris. And so give Kashmiris in your community an opportunity to tell their stories. We don't have to speak for them. As we've seen in recent years and really for decades, they are extraordinary writers, artists, spokespeople. Give them a platform, amplify them. And look, I mean, social media is interesting. I don't think it's everything, but I also don't think it's nothing. And we've seen just in recent days that it matters. It matters when there's a groundswell of support that leads to folks like Rihanna and Greta Thunberg speaking. I'm not saying that it's going to, move the dial. But what I'm saying is when you have a movement, more and more people join, more and more people you kind of swell the ranks. And so I would just say use your voice, use your platform, use your communities, uplift Kashmiris, and make sure your elected representatives are speaking about Kashmiris.
Thank you, Professor Seti. We could take a question from the audiences. That is, why has so little been done to create a support network for Kashmiris in India through the use of social media, including YouTube? I don't know if we are so well placed to answer that question, but Mirza Saib Beg, you have worked in that part of the world. What do you think? What's our problem there in
I would
India?
say that it's very difficult to build an open support network within India. And see, if you look at all the protests that have taken place in the last 2 years, from the CAA protesters, how they were dealt with, and after that you see right now also with the farmer protests, how they are being dealt with, how they get vilified and attacked, and they constantly have to reassert their nationalism to prove that they're not foreign funded or brainwashed or even terrorists. So it's very difficult to have an open support network within India. But I must say this, that there are groups in India who empathize and support the struggle of Kashmiris. They even believe in the right to self-determination, but these are very small in number. There are circles that support the struggle, and they believe that Kashmiris have the right to decide for themselves, and that's the only way to resolve this dispute. And they also understand that there is no way to keep a military presence in Kashmir till eternity. Like, what is the solution to that? How long is this army going to be present over there? How long do you want to keep fighting? Because their soldiers are also dying in this. So there is a thin space that we have to negotiate and discuss and make inroads. But I do feel that one of the big failures in India has been that there has never been a proper anti-war effort. Because in India right now, there's a lot of pro-state fanaticism. There's a cheering for war, as you have seen after Pulwama, the Balakot attacks, and general rhetoric that is used, that is deployed in politics in India. The whole rhetoric of "Ghar mein ghuske marenge" and things that are just thrown around casually. For every other thing, the political rhetoric is that we haven't kept these nuclear weapons for Diwali. And there are no repercussions for the use of such loose language, which in any international setting, if you'd see political leaders talk like this, there would be people baying for their resignation or their removal in politics. But you don't see that happening in India. And this gives you an indication of the level of repression. Because my personal belief is that colonization never ended after the British left the subcontinent. Colonization didn't end, it just changed hands. There were white colonizers earlier, and now there are brown colonizers who colonize each other. So there is still a reformist movement that is required within Indian society, which leads an anti-war effort, which emphasizes that the job of political leaders in India is not to deploy the army endlessly. It is to negotiate, to discuss, to debate, and then arrive at a solution which is agreeable, which ends the loss of life over there. So this is why I feel that it has not happened in India yet, but there are spaces which are being made. And in some way, I don't want to use the term benefit, but in some way, in a very minor way, there is a small awareness which is taking place in India right now, because even Indians are seeing what's happening. For example, just yesterday, you saw Sachin Tendulkar and all these Bollywood actors come forward and support the government narrative on what is taking place and how they should not talk. International actors should not talk about what is happening in India. And you see Indians also adding these things in their head, that it clearly looks like they are supporting a particular narrative. And always we have seen this, that when it comes to Kashmir, Indians also know that their politicians tell them lies, their media misleads them. But when it comes to Kashmir, these things are forgotten because they don't understand, they don't have on-ground access. So they are living in an ecosystem of misinformation, which is then reinforced to them through their media, through their movies, through their popular celebrities. So there is little access for them to challenge this narrative. But these spaces are being created, and we as Kashmiris also, and I do recognize that this is a double oppression on us. That one, we are already oppressed, and two, we have to fight to advocate that we are oppressed. That yes, look at this. So it's a double oppression that is imposed on us. But this is this is something that is a burden on us that we have to discharge. We have to keep continuously engage, talk on all sides, in Pakistan, in India, and within Kashmir also, and come to create these spaces which will lead the effort against authoritarianism, against oppression, against occupation everywhere.
Well, Mir, I have a point to add over here. Just a quick point, if you permit.
Yes, please do.
Yeah. Well, as Mirza Sahib has very eloquently put it forward, but I think it's pretty unfortunate that when it comes to Kashmir, so the right, the left, and the center in India, it holds more or less a very same opinion. Unfortunately, the majority of Indians, they still subscribe to that development argument, which happens to be a redundant colonial argument. They don't believe in extending civic liberties to Kashmiris. They believe that it is basically the fault of Kashmiris, that why do they go outside and they protest and they get scum to the pellet guns and they get blinded. So when you are dealing with that kind of mentality, so you do not have that liberty of orchestrating public support for a certain cause. There are indeed individual voices, there are sane voices there, but they are again in a very sparse proportion, and they are very at a very bare minimum. Unfortunately, Kashmir, it is like it is the victim of an internal colonialism, and it is the continuity of a post-colonial colonialism which we are experiencing. But I think the time will have to change. And just one last quick point, when you were saying that what could be immediately done as the advocacy for the advocacy, the people who sympathize with the cause of Kashmir, I think the first and the foremost demand should be making it a non-violent, this region should be made non-violent, so that Kashmiris should less suffer. So that suffering argument should be first done with, and then we can go ahead, as Victoria said, with all and out resolution of the conflict. But before that, at least all of the actors, they can raise a homogeneous voice, making it a non-violent dispute. Like there are so many conflicts across the world, but no one suffers like Kashmiris are suffering.
Thank you so much.
Dr. Mir, can I just make one tiny point? I think, we used to hope that civil society in India would understand, and certainly there are groups in civil society who have made sort of comments, and a body of very, very courageous Indians have outspoken. Unfortunately, we're in this mindset now, particularly reinforced by the social media sound bites, where it's too easy to bash Pakistan, bash Kashmiris. But I think if one really wanted to make inroads, it would be to have a schedule of how much the Indian civil society, Indians in general, are losing out because of this vast expenditure on militarizing Jammu and Kashmir. And I think that's one way forward, because, as I said, the millions that are spent in defense and budgets in the army, compared with poverty eradication, India may look like a wealthy society. It may call itself the greatest democracy, but certainly it is not for the lower echelons of that pyramid. It's a pyramidical society. So if one wants to make any inroads, it's to produce statistics, facts and figures of how much it's costing the average Indian to keep up the militarization. And that's one thing I think one could do, and engage civil society, because Indians in general are decent people. It's just unfortunate they've got a very, very retrogressive government at the moment.
Mr. Mir, I really want to respond to your question number 2. What requires special attention?
Yes.
What needs to be, should be on the top of on the news? That is the plight of the widows of Indian occupied Kashmir, whose husbands and the bread earners of the family have been killed by the occupation forces. They are indeed living under miserable condition, mental trauma, and finding it hard to maintain connection between their bodies and souls, particularly when they are living under fear of the rampaging Indian security forces. Beside these widows, they are the women in Indian occupied Kashmir. Victoria rightly mentioned. Those are called as half widows, whose husbands have been taken away by the Indian occupation forces during search operations, never to be heard of again. These women, called half widows, according to the sources, number between 3,500 to 4,000. Unaware of their husbands' whereabouts, these women not only endure the grief that comes from being separated from their spouses, but are also constantly struggling to survive. Their husbands either still alive in the custody of Indian security forces or dead at the hands of Indian occupation forces have not been declared deceased, hence the term, they are termed half widows. The only thing that keeps them alive is the hope that one day they will be reunited with their husbands and their children and hold their father's hand. This hope only alleviates their miseries and reduces their pain to some extent. This thing is, really important, because people usually talk about conflict and all that, and they forget the miseries being faced by women and children. And I mean, if you talk about the women of Indian occupied Kashmir, they are victims of objectification, stigmatization, this mental trauma, half widows. The women whose husbands have been disappeared by the security forces, they do not know about their whereabouts, where they are. They cannot remarry according to the religion. So these are the issues of the women of Indian occupied Kashmir needs to be highlighted in not only in international media, but because the rights organization, women rights organization around the world, they should take up this this case on emergency and urgent basis, because women of Indian occupied Kashmir are the worst sufferer of rape and this thing. So that thing should be keep on the top in the priority list to address the issues being faced by people of Indian occupied Kashmir. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Shubha Ashraf. I'd like to also thank the panelists and the audience from the depth of my heart. I'd like to also ask the panelists if they would like to share their websites, and we'll give your Facebook is on, and we can also share your emails and your favorite social media with the audience, so that they can stay in touch with you, and hopefully you won't mind it. With that, in closing, I want to thank all of you, of course. I'm part of the 8 million people living under the direct brutal control of 800,000 Indian Army armed forces in Kashmir, and 6 million Kashmiris that are living outside the occupation. They all are going to be thanking you for years to come. I want to express the gratitude of all Kashmiri people to today's panelists for speaking to the world in their behalf and doing a stellar job of it. But before we dismiss today, would be remiss if we did not remember those innocent people who have died since our last Solidarity Day, and have passed on as innocent victims of occupation. And no less, we want to remember the dozens of innocent farmer protesters in the outskirts of Delhi in India, who are demanding their right to farm as they please. And these are the same farmers and people around whom the Kashmiri students in colleges and universities fled and were given support by these people, many of them Sikhs and some Hindus also in Punjab, when Kashmiri students had nowhere to go. And today, many of them have died during this protest, dozens of them. So let us have a moment of silence for all those brothers and sisters, whether they be in Kashmir or they be in Punjab or Haryana or others in India that died as protesting farmers. Thank you so much, and God bless. Thank you for being with us. And until the next time, Allah Hafiz. God bless you all.
Allah Hafiz. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, panel.